I am delighted to be able to introduce our speaker, William Dalrymple, the best-selling author, the Wolfson Prize-winning White Mughals, The Last Mughal, which won the Duff Cooper Prize, the Hemingway and Kapuscinski Prize-winning Return of a King, so that's 3 books, and the 4th, his most recent, is The Anarchy, which was longlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize of 2019, shortlisted for the Duke of Wellington Medal for Military History, for the Tata Book of the Year Nonfiction Award, the Historical Writers Award of 2020, the finalist for the Curdell Book Prize for History, and it won the 2020 Arthur Ross Medal from the U.S. Center for Council for Foreign Relations. Really, William. Well, a selection of these books will be available to buy from our independent bookseller, Fox Allen Books, outside. And for those of you who are interested, William will also be signing some of the copies, I think. He's been awarded 5 honorary doctorates. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, the Royal Asiatic Society, the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He's held visiting fellowships at Princeton, Brown, and in Oxford. He writes regularly for the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, and the Guardian, and has been presented with the prestigious British Academy's President's Medal in 2020, named one of the top 50 intellectuals for 2020 by Prospect Magazine, and the founder and co-director of the Jaipur Literature Festival, which has been billed as the largest or greatest literary event on earth, I think. Okay, so he's joining us this afternoon to talk about his amazing career. He'll kick off with a small talk, I think, and then we'll have a short conversation, followed by questions, comments, thoughts that you, our audience members, might have. William, welcome.
Thank you very much. These are the 4 books, all in a nice slip jacket, and this is the man who really enabled all of it. And I can hear from that cheer in the audience that I think this room is probably full of Bruce's friends, all of whom I'm sure miss him as much as I do. He was a completely unique character, quite unlike anyone else I've ever met. As Indrajit said, a scholar, a traveler, a wonderful friend, a cook, a musician, an apparator of Persian musicians from nowhere, a house guest who never left serially over a period of 20 years, but a joyous presence. There was some incredibly irritating reviews of the book which Barnaby Rogerson put together of memoirs of Bruce that described him as a sort of almost like a sort of parasite, which is the opposite was true. Bruce was someone who enriched any room he ever walked into, and suddenly, the room would be sort of strung with sort of strange hangings from Qatar, and a hanging garden of pot plants would appear. A Baroque harpsichord would be erected in one corner, and suddenly a sort of 10 Persian musicians would start singing ghazals in another corner, and he just had this ability to turn the mundane into the extraordinary. And all our lives, I think, are diminished by his absence. This picture here is the last time I saw him. He'd been the night before to a preview of the show of Company School Paintings, Forgotten Masters, which he'd been an incredible help with. And in the course of this final lunch, he recited perfectly from heart a ghazal of Hafez, which he then translated. The night is dark, I am afraid of the waves. This savage whirlpool terrifies me. You who walk on the distant shore, light burdened, what do you know of my inner state? And it was, I think, he felt as much as we all did, the terrible injustice that this life should be cut off so young. And it's a great honor and pleasure to have the honor of remembering him here today. Thank you for this. And thank you, Lisa, wherever you are, for organizing it, and Bruce and all the very other people who have contributed to this actually happening. And I hope it'll become a much-loved annual event in the calendar. Just a few pictures of Bruce to start with. This is Bruce, sort of fantastically sort of cravated, halfway up some monument in Afghanistan. When I was in Herat, where this picture was taken, I met various people that had met Bruce at the height of the Afghan Civil War, and he'd come with the Mujahideen on horseback across Afghanistan, like some sort of 1920s or possibly a sort of 1820s or possibly 1780s traveller, and halfway through whatever he was up to then, he'd heard that there was some early ghazals of some Persian poet I'd never heard of, inscribed on a wall of some mosque in the Soviet side, and he crossed over the border on a donkey and disappeared for 2 weeks. They all assumed he'd been captured and tortured. He ambled back 2 weeks later, very happy, having transcribed this, and wrote some obscure scholarly paper on these early ghazals, which appeared and delighted his friends. And this was him at the very end. He had a nice job from the Aga Khan, writing down all the, inscribing all the tombstones in the Ghazagar and Kabul. And he was never happier than when working on these extraordinary inscriptions. I'm quickly going to just run through the work we did together over 20 years, because one of the extraordinary things about Bruce was, though he was a man of enormous learning in a huge variety of topics, and has helped an enormous number of people with their research. He produced an oddly slim bibliography himself. He didn't really enjoy writing, and he found it difficult. And I was the lucky recipient of much of his learning. And these 4 books, the Company Quartet, which we did together over 20 years between 1999 and 2019, and it was published just, I think, 2 weeks before he got his diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, contains so much that was, completely unobtainable from other sources. Most obviously, Bruce was a superb translator of Mughal Persian. And Mughal Persian is a sort of, it's been reinforced since his absence of how very few people can actually read this clearly and translate it lucidly. India, from the 12th century onwards, became part of the Persianate world. And just like France was used in Tolstoy and Russia as a diplomatic court language, so Persian was for 600 years of Indian history. And today, there are only a handful of scholars that can read it. And the more that I send stuff around to people to translate, the more you realize that even they sort of stumble over shorthand or scribal tics that Bruce seemed to be able to take in his stride and understand and translate with great ease. And we would go to obscure libraries in Tonk or Patna or the British Library here or the National Archives in Delhi. And we'd photocopy these things, eventually end up back home with a nice sheaf of copies. And Bruce would read it as fluently as if it was the sort of front page of the Times, and give wonderful, superb translations in his gorgeous prose. It's a skill which amazingly few people have. It's a lost art, and the more that India moves away from its Persianate past and its Islamic history, the more that loss needs to be can be felt. Because, in a sense, the thing that distinguishes these 4 books, I think, is Bruce's translations. The fact that there's huge seams of work which Bruce produced from a rich variety of Persian language sources over 4 books, which most of which had simply never ever been translated into English before. And it's difficult to think of another field in history where one could stumble on whole libraries of untranslated manuscripts that no one simply bothered to look at. And it's much easier to do a sort of post-colonial thesis analyzing Orientalism in travel writing or something that just involves getting books out of the library and sort of applying a bit of Said to it. The real hard work of the rock face of going in and translating these very complex sources and working out what's useful and what isn't is something that Bruce excelled in, and it is a massive loss. Just to run very, very quickly through some pictures and the books prior to talking to Indrajit, just to have a quick canter. The first book we worked together was called White Mughals. It involved a lot of sources from Hyderabad, which is now the Deccan is receiving a lot of attention from scholars, but at that period 20 years ago, there'd been remarkably little work on any period of the Deccan history, and very, very little on early 19th century Deccan and Hyderabad, which was the last sort of stranded fragment of the Mughal Empire, sitting on its own in the middle of the Deccan. And it was the story of a Persian princess who brought up in India, who fell in love with a man called James Achilles Kirkpatrick, if we can wind forward to him. We got lots of pictures of all these characters. Hang on, here we are. Here is James Kirkpatrick. And the two, well, certainly Karanisa got pregnant, and then the vizier at the court began to blackmail Kirkpatrick using this knowledge. And there was a spectacular source, which had never been used before, called the Tufat al-Alam by Karanisa's uncle, who's called Abdul Latif Shushtri. And the first time I ever contacted Bruce to work together was to translate this document that I'd found in Hyderabad. And it turned out to be a very juicy source. Abdul Latif Shushtri was a sort of 18th century Persian versus a version of V.S. Naipaul, who huffed and puffed and complained about everything Indian, and wrote sort of fantastically clear and precise prose about the many reasons he didn't like the country he was writing about. We had great fun doing this book together, the extraordinary story of this forgotten world of British men who shed their skin, their skin in many ways, and took on the ways of India. People like William Fraser, seen here, painted by Raeburn in Edinburgh before he set out to India. On arrival, you can see he's still got his Scottish hat on, but everything else south of there is beginning to transform. And here he is with his Persian calligraphy pens and his Mughal jama. And as he goes on, he gets more. His beard grows longer, and he's kind of more and more lost to this other world, which he found enormously attractive. And then again, this was a world which Bruce intuitively understood and felt for, because he had been entirely seduced by the Persian world and all that it represented to him. And as well as just translating these documents, Bruce guided me through the etiquette of Persian court language, and in a whole variety of ways was a sort of tutor and educator. He was also a very severe critic, and a whole different side of his character would emerge when you gave him a bit of manuscript to comment on, and very, very sort of snarly comments would appear in your margins. But they were very useful, of course. I mean, this was pre-publication, thank God. He luckily never got to review any of my books after that. Anyway, from the next book, this is old Karanisa and Kirkpatrick. This is the extraordinary residence in Hyderabad, now restored thanks partly to a £1 million cheque read by one reader of White Mughals, which was given to the World Monuments Fund. Again, none of this would have been possible without Bruce's enormous help. And this is in the garden of the residency, Karanisa's extraordinary Rang Mahal, which was alongside this perfect Palladian villa. You get the perfect Mughal pleasure palace where Karanisa lived amid fountains and parterres and gorgeous gardens. And this was also falling apart. And this was Karanisa's uncle who tried to arrange for her exile and in the midst of the scandal that broke out, Mir Alam. Anyway, and these are the children born of this marriage. But after that, we went on to the last Mughal. There's a whole extraordinary archive sitting in the National Archive in Delhi of the Mutiny Papers, which were basically the papers gathered by the victorious British after what we call the Indian Mutiny, what's known in India as the First War of Independence. And they were used to hang and prosecute people who had been involved in any way in the uprising, the largest anti-colonial uprising in the 19th century. And miraculously, these papers had kind of never been used, except by a few Urdu scholars at Aligarh who'd written in Urdu and Persian about them. But in English, they were completely virgin. And it is an invaluable record in Urdu and Persian of the largest anti-colonial revolt in history. And Bruce and another scholar called Mahmood Farooqi went to work, Mahmood working on the Urdu, Bruce working on the Persian. And the last Mughal was the result, the story of Bahadur Shah Zafar, seen here, who was a wonderful calligrapher, coming right at the end of the Mughal period, but who, although he'd been shorn of all money, of all resources, nevertheless catalyzed the last great flourishing of Mughal letters, and the age of Zafar, the age of Ghalib, the age of Zawq is to Urdu poetry what the age of Elizabeth is to, and Shakespeare is to the English sonnet or the Elizabethan stage. And again, just to go hurl through, these are Zafar's notebooks. Even if you can't read the Urdu, you can see the extraordinary sort of poetic imagination, couplet after couplet, tumbling off the page, and every like these little tiny moleskin notebooks he would use. And then it all resulted in the great uprising and all the killings that followed. After that, we set to work on a book called Return of the King, which was set in Afghanistan and was the story of the 1839 to 42 First Afghan War, famously the most sort of tragic and ill-conceived imperial adventure of all times, when the East India Company thought it would conquer Afghanistan with the greatest of ease. And of course, they famously ended in the retreat from Kabul of 1842, when, at least according to legend, only one man stumbled into Jalalabad, Dr. Bryden on his horse. What was, again, fascinating was that there were spectacular Afghan sources for this, which had simply never been used. Everyone had always repeated the same old English sources, which had been worked on beautifully, in most popular form by Peter Hopkirk, who turned them into a whole series of best-selling stories. But the Afghan narratives include biographies, memoirs, and entire epic poems where all the British characters were these sort of devious, including Alexander Burns, who's often still written as a very sort of sympathetic character, but in Afghanistan is regarded as sort of Beelzebub, Shaitan, and every other conceivable demon combined. And we got these documents in one day in Kabul, as directed to a wonderful bookshop in Jawi Shir by the then head of the Chancellor of Kabul University, one Ashraf Ghani, who then, of course, went on to be president and then fled the country to Dubai in ignominy last year. But we found in one day, literally the most successful day of research in my entire life, thanks to Ashraf, this wonderful bookseller who had just bought up all the princely libraries of Afghanistan in the 1970s when people began to emigrate, or in the 1980s, and was willingly sold the whole lot. So we worked on these for 5 years, and the result was this extraordinary book that gave an entirely new spin to a very familiar story of imperial hubris, with Alexander Burns, Shah Shuja, who looks a bit like sort of Gimli from Lord of the Rings here, but is actually the descendant of Timur, and the story of this great army of Indian mercenaries, the sepoys, heading up under East India Company leadership through the Bolan Pass into Afghanistan, where they successfully managed to install Shah Shuja on the throne. But of course, it ends in terrible hubris. What was quite amusing about all this is that it came out just as the whole thing was beginning to fall apart again in the run-up to the final humiliation last summer. And we all got called to Karzai, to Afghanistan, to brief President Karzai, who wanted to know, because he was from the same, not only the same clan, but the same tiny sub-clan as Shah Shuja, and saw history repeating. So we came to this deal whereby I would come during Ramadan and would sort of, like Sherazad, entertain him in the evening after his iftar. And he would then give me an interview for an hour in return. So we came to this deal. And then he decided that he didn't want to suffer the fate of Shah Shuja and immediately changed his policy towards America. And a whole series of telegrams, unknown to us at the time, began shooting backwards and forwards between the State Department and Hillary Clinton. Because why has Karzai changed his policy? And they identified Return of the King as the reason. And this all then got leaked in WikiLeaks and turned up on the front page of the New York Times. So an unexpected boost to sales in America for this book, but courtesy of Mr. Putin, not a man who's been working on my sales otherwise, I think. Anyway, we had an extraordinary time, and Bruce got to meet Karzai and go into the Arg, and a rather different world to the one he'd been inhabiting in villages and strange parts of Afghanistan on his donkey in the 1980s. And then finally, the Anarchy, the most recent one. Again, this time using mainly documents from the Red Fort Library, which is sitting not even catalogued properly in the British Library. And we would often merge with photocopies after months of negotiations, and Bruce would set to work. One occasion, it had been so completely miscatalogued, it turned out to be a story about Shah Jahan period. But when Bruce got his sort of teeth into a text, it was very difficult to extract it, even though it was quite clear this was 200 years before the period we were actually writing about. And then he found some passage about some lion that raped a sadhu, and there was some terrible ejaculation that went all over the sadhu, and Bruce got so excited by this, he wouldn't stop, and we lost an entire season of work. Bruce thought this was some great lost text, not a word of which ever appeared in this book, of course. And he said he was a bit like the Queen Mary. It took weeks to turn him round once. Anyway, in the end, we'd got some extraordinary, and I think the translations he did for this book are some of the most magnificent. It'd be very nice if we could all produce one day a book of Bruce's translations. I've got them all stacked away, because they are the only translations of so many of these sources. Anyway, in this case, the story of the founding of the East India Company, going back in a sense to the beginning of the story, and the story of the East India Company. Here is the East India Company headquarters. It is a corporation. It is occupied, came out of an office only 5 windows wide, set back slightly from the street, tiny little office. Yet from that building, the conquest of the richest country in the world was masterminded by a staff in England. A century into the East India Company's history, only 35 employees in the head office. And in India at the time of Plassey, only 250 white men. Yet they used their networks with the Jain and Marwari bankers to borrow money and built up an army of 200,000 sepoys, which was twice the size of the British Army, but answerable not to Downing Street, not to the Foreign Office, not to the British Army, but instead to this corporation operating out of this tiny office in Leadenhall Street. It's one of the most bizarre stories in history. Bruce's extraordinary translations from the Persian illuminated this absolutely brilliantly. There's one particular source which had actually already been translated, but was just illustrating how good these are. This was Ghulam Hussain Khan's Ser Mutakarin, which is writing about colonialism just as it's beginning, in very much the same mode as Edward Said wrote in the 1970s. But while Said was looking back on colonialism from the 70s and seeing how what it had done to indigenous cultures and the loss of confidence that it produced, Ghulam Hussain Khan was writing it in the 1780s, just as it was beginning, and he was noting the way that, for example, that once the British were in charge, there was no longer any work for architects who built in the Mughal style, carpenters who produced Indian woodwork, painters who produced Indian miniatures that were not prepared to change their tune to paint for the new masters. And this extraordinary look at how the culture of India was warped and so many great traditions died as a result of this monstrous corporation. Maybe we'll leave the end of talk about the company to discussion with Indrajit and hand over to him now. But this was our last great collaboration. Say Bruce came to the publication party, as ever the last to leave the party, and 2 weeks later said he was going in to get his results from the NHS, and his decline was horribly quick. This was, I suppose, November, and he was dead by February. And in 4 months, this amazing, wonderful, talented life was extinguished. But how wonderful that we have a lecture, at least, to remember him each year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, William.
Thank you.
It's very touching, but it does sort of, I think everyone here will really want to hear how you and Bruce got together in the first place. I mean, I think we'd like to hear the juicy bits. If I may.
There's lots of juicy bits.
Well, yes, at your discretion.
So I first met Bruce in Islamabad. I had a cousin who was supposedly working for the FAO, but I have my suspicions that other things were going on as well. And he and Bruce struck up a friendship because my cousin had a piano. And one thing that Bruce would always commandeer wherever he was a grand piano. I mean, over the years, I've seen Bruce befriend the most unlikely people. Most recently, I mean, in the end, there was this extraordinary American diplomat in Delhi who was I think, again, was probably linked somehow to intelligence services. But at this stage, in his career, he was the number 2 in the American embassy in Delhi, and he had this extraordinary Kazakh bodybuilder wife and a grand piano because he was a Shostakovich fan. He was somewhere from the American Midwest and had been passionate about Shostakovich, and this had led him to study Russian, and his career got diverted. And Bruce met him at some party. And we ended up sort of spending a lot of time with the bodybuilder, playing as Bruce and he played sort of competitive duets on the piano. Again, competition was an important part of Bruce's piano playing. One of the most wonderful essays in this book, which I strongly recommend to you, of Bruce memoirs, is this wonderful description of Bruce sort of edging other people off the piano as with his piano playing.
Great. And tell us about how you sort of got drawn into this world, you know, the world of Asia, of South Asia, and, you know, which eventually led to this collaboration. But what inspired you?
Entirely by accident. I had an entirely Scottish childhood. I went to school near here. I used to come to York Station from the age of 8 for 10 years and then go up to Ampleforth in the North Yorkshire Moors, now clouded in controversy and scandal, but in those days considered a great shining example of Catholic education. And I was very happy there for 10 years and always wanted to become an archaeologist. I had planned to go to Iraq, and the thing fell through at the last minute. And ended up with a friend in India. But once there, discovered that I had not only had generations of my family, because I kept bumping into sort of street names and other things which I knew were connected with various bits of my family. And in fact, there have been 10 generations of my family born, died, worked in India for the company and the Raj. And indeed, I had both Mughal and Hindu Bengali blood from Chandanagar, neither of which I was aware of, but which emerged in the course of writing these books and looking into papers. It was very odd, because I had no link to India that I was aware of, but immediately fell for this place within a few weeks of arriving in Dehradun to teach in a school in 1984. And really, I suppose I've been still on the longest year off in history. It's a sort of extended gap year that never ended.
But it's fascinating. You talk about these sort of entwined histories, so to speak. You know, there's Mughal heritage, there's Hindu heritage, there's English heritage, and a lot of these were themes in the White Mughal. And that sort of troubles a lot of assumptions on all sides of the debate, you know, whether it's nationalists there, nationalists here. How did you sort of navigate those worlds? And how did the book navigate those worlds?
So you're right. I mean, the White Mughals is a story which doesn't fit into any sort of accepted category. The idea that the colonialists of the East India Company, who were so busy asset stripping, looting and plundering the country, were also the ones who intermarried. Was something which sort of had got lost in the historical wash. But the extraordinary sources for them in the British Library, because 2/3 of the company servants which went out to India never came back. They died. And as a result, the East India Company was continually involved in legal disputes with relatives who thought they should be receiving large legacies that never arrived. And so they drew up a system whereby, from quite an early point in their history, wills had to be sent back to London and a copy kept in Leadenhall Street. And all these wills are now in the British Library. So you can read the private wills of every single servant that ever joined the East India Company, from even if they didn't die out there, from I think the 1770s. And the early ones, particularly the 1770s, 1780s, 1 in 3 record an Indian wife or an Anglo-Indian child. And these documents will be seen by the families. So, one can extrapolate upwards from that there may be many others who didn't record this. But it has its own, racism, like everything else, has its own history, and it goes down very quickly. So from 1 in 3 in 1780, it's 1 in 4 wills has an Indian companion by 1800, 1 in 5 wills by about 1810, and it's kind of more or less completely over by 1840. And the two peoples have moved apart. But in that period, in that brief period, you have exactly, in a sense, what you find so often today. Two people get together from different cultures, and in different ways they make their accommodations. So in some households, everyone's wearing Indian clothes and sitting on the floor. Yes, yeah. In other households, Mughal begums will dress in full Georgian finery and take on the way of the colonizers, and everything in between. With all sorts of different, and not only do you have wills, you often have inventories of goods, and you find these, nominal 18th century gentlemen with puckduns, spittoons, with betel nut holders, with hookahs, with the whole paraphernalia of the material, the full material wherewithal of Mughal gentlemen, but there's no Mughal gentleman in sight. These are men from Cotswold or from Sheriff Hutton or something.
So what happens that sort of drives the two apart? Is it a policy of active segregation by the rulers? Is it something else? What's going on? I mean, because it looks like it would have been a very happy commingling.
There is a very brief moment when it is extraordinary, when you do have this mixture, but two things happen. One is, well, 2 or 3 things happen. First of all, the rise of sort of utilitarianism and evangelical Christianity, and you get far more forceful missionary activity, which then as now upsets many people. And the sort of restrictions now being put on missionaries actually was put on by the East India Company initially. And then the evangelicals, particularly a man called Charles Grant, who becomes a company director, removes the restrictions on missionaries. And suddenly the missionaries are all over company stations. People are putting up the 10 Commandments in Urdu outside their collectorates. Generals are reading the 10 Commandments or the Psalms to Brahmin sepoys lined up on parade, unable to run off. And this creates a world where rumors of mass conversion come to be believed because there's enough evidence of religious zeal on behalf of the company to give substance to these rumors. So all that stuff about the grease cartridges and so on finds a ready audience and plays directly into the uprising of 1857. And then I think simply it's the matter of power. The British, if you are vulnerable, and unpowerful, you necessarily will have to have more respect for the people who can, or at least be wary and cautious of the people who possess the power. In that case, the Mughals, up to when Joshua Child in the I think the 1690s launches an attack on Aurangzeb's Mughals, the East India Company is crushed in 3 weeks, and the factors put in chains and paraded around Agra and so on, and the company has to come on bended knee and beg for forgiveness. But by the 1780s, there's been a military revolution, the Mughal Empire has broken down, and the company can now begin to lord over the people it was supplicant to. So you get a huge change in attitudes, and this moment of equality when there is transfer in both directions gives way. And it's a very brief moment. It lasts 40 years. Yeah. But it's there. and it's not in the history books. And it's a very different world to the world we think of when we think of empire and we think of Curzon and viceroys and so on. And it's quite an attractive period. It doesn't just happen in India. You get similar things going on, for example, in New Zealand with Maoris or with Native Americans in the New World. But it's kind of over by the beginning of the 19th century, and by the middle of the 19th century, it's totally dead.
Yeah, fascinating. And of course, then that leads you to sort of write about the last Mughal and the collapse, which is very beautifully put in your work, and also very poignant. Thinking about the last Mughal emperor, who sort of considers himself at the center of the world, but except no one else does. And what was that world like for those who who were dying out? What was that sort of?
Well, as you say, I mean, there are wonderful. I mean, one of the great sort of surprises working on all four of these books with Bruce was that there was such a rich literature from that class, the Mughal class, who were suddenly finding themselves suddenly now they were basically, that whole class existed on cavalry warfare. And when cavalry warfare became rather like, we've seen how tank warfare in Ukraine in the last couple of months, that it seems that these new missiles can just open open tanks like tin openers. In the same way, the Mughal governing class, with the new infantry revolution of the 18th century, were useless. You could do as many cavalry charges as you like, but when you met an East India Company square, armed with horse artillery and muskets, you'd be blown to smithereens. And so this whole class found themselves without a job. And one of the last things they could do was write their memoirs. So, and there's all these extraordinary works, very few of which have been translated into English, very little of which has been studied before.
And that's where the translator's work, I guess, becomes so important, because you can extrapolate a lot from the bigger histories, the larger histories, but it's what's going on that the translators bring to life for you.
I mean, what was so wonderful about Bruce was that, I mean, normally, I suppose, if you're not capable of reading the language yourself, and this is really complex stuff. It's not an easy script to read, particularly if you have shorthand or and in non-printed sources, where it's actually with manuscript sources. And Bruce would come and stay, often for 6 months at a time. He had a very strange method of working. He would live a very full life. He'd get up quite late. He would appear at breakfast at sort of 11 o'clock, and often in a kind of lungi or something, and not much else. And for breakfast, he used to like having fresh baguette, which he organised to be delivered from Cannes Market, bon maman jam, a thick slab of butter, often an inch thick, and then he'd put on top of it lint 90% dark chocolate. And this is something apparently his Belgian aunts had taught him to anyway, and this would sort of give way to quite long lunches, when often very grand guests would turn up, strange sort of ex-presidents of Sri Lanka, or opera singers, or curators at the British Library or British Museum, or orientalist scholars from far parts. And then he'd take a siesta.
We haven't started
and then there'd be
yet,
time for tea, which he would then sort of serve with this sort of baroque sort of, he loved making sort of, particularly delicate shortbreads, and taught our lovely Bengali cook, who makes very good sort of Bengali fish curries, but didn't know what shortbread was until Bruce turned up in the house. It's a perfect petit four and things would suddenly emerge at tea time, and then there'd be gin and tonics, but then he'd get to work, and he'd start work normally about 6 or 7 in the evening, or possibly even later, and would work all night. Without a break, and rarely slept in a bed. He loved sort of snoozing in a chair or sitting in but with these very unusual hours, would produce often huge reams of work. And occasionally you'd come back from a party and see Bruce typing away downstairs by light. But he seemed to be someone who did no work at all, because he never worked during the day.
During the day, yes.
But lots of stuff would turn up.
And one of the things that you've written about Bruce earlier, and you sort of, it's very obvious in the works, is, he has this ability to convey not just the words of the writers, but also their worldviews. And I think, the Afghan king, the Shah Shuja that you mentioned, he writes about Shah Shuja thinking about what sort of person that king might be.
Bruce's translations used to come with sort of enormously long footnotes. There'd be sort of 10 lines of text, and then there'd be 3 pages of footnotes when he'd give his theory about why such and such had happened, or what the sort of man. And again, these were things that, I very actively used and even plagiarized, and he would have brilliant insights just brilliant insights into why such and such a thing had happened, and his incredible understanding of that world. And he had this strange sympathy with it. I think he saw himself very much as one of these sort of old Mughal gentlemen, sitting with his ghazals and he produced these beautiful translations of their poetry, which again it'd be lovely if we could translate them and sort of publish them in some form or other.
Sure. And I have to ask you this because you've sort of referred to this a bit already, but what have you found to be the challenges of writing around that period, which is so controversial on all sides of the border, whether it's Indian, whether it's British, whether it's Pakistani in that sense? What have been your sort of challenges?
Well, in a sense, it's not the controversial period, in the sense that if I was writing about Aurangzeb, it would land you in trouble with everyone, because here is someone who's a huge hero in Pakistan and is a hate figure in India. What was lovely was that Bruce and I had found together this little period of history, not little, a period of 100 years, when very little work had been done on it. The late Mughal period is still one of the most underwritten periods, and very few people know about it. And someone like Zafar is not a threatening figure, even to an RSS ideologue. He's someone that clearly negotiated both cultures, took on Hindu murids as well as Muslim ones. And the work, I think, of those 4 books really hasn't got me in trouble even with this new dispensation, who absolutely loathe the Mughals and are actively writing them out of history textbooks, discussing eradicating their monuments, and rewriting textbooks to demonize them. And but this late Mughal period isn't in a sense what they're aiming their guns at. They're aiming it at Akbar. They're aiming it at Aurangzeb and Shah Jahan. And the same is true of I think, Indian academia. There's very few people working on this period. So it isn't as if we've been treading into a territory which is hotly contested. And if I'd been writing about partition or Gandhi, or, there would be 700 other people who would know the period better, who would shoot anything one wrote full of holes. But it was very nice finding this period. That there were a few people working on it, but not many, and often very sympathetic people, because in a sense, what you're dealing with are history's losers. They're not there's lots of stuff about in the Indian press at the moment about historians who glorify the Mughals, but in a sense, there's nothing to glorify about Zafar or Shah Alam II, or these are these sort of tragic characters disowned, already orphaned by history, and so it hasn't been a rocky ride from that point of view. Many other scholars, like Audrey Trushka and James Lang, writing about Marathas, have found themselves on the wrong side of the government. But I, so far, haven't.
Yeah, so far, yes. And which brings me to my last question, and then we'll have invite comments and questions from the audience. You've now been in India and South Asia more generally for about 3 decades or so. In what ways have you found the region changed, whether it's whichever way, socially, in a literary sense?
Well, in some ways, and in some areas, there is little change. The things I loved in my first book about India's City of Jinns, the Dargah, Nizamuddin, the calligraphers in the old city, a lot of continuities survive for all the change. But in other ways, immeasurably different in terms of just sort of geography. Delhi is now I think 4 times the size, 26 million if you count all the Noida
Suburbs
and Gurgaon and all the other bits on the side. Second largest metropolis on earth now, while it was, barely 1 million probably when I arrived. Politically, obviously, a difficult period for. The current dispensation is both very popular and very right-wing. It doesn't particularly warm to liberal scholars of any sort, and I think academics of all stripes have found difficulty even getting visas. We run a literary festival that operates on a tightrope, and it isn't easy now in that world, and it's very sad. It's very sad. But but the government is very popular. It's democratically elected, and there's nothing in a sense to be done. The opposition has crumbled. There is no opposition. So one way or another we have to live with it. And no, it doesn't make me love things more.
Sure, it's tricky. But you've been able to pull off the Jaipur Literary Festival over the last 2 decades now, or is it 10 years?
2004.
Okay, so it's almost two decades. Yeah.
And that is a great pleasure. It has. One of the other things that didn't happen much in India before, when I first arrived there, was you'd meet Indian authors at events like this. You'd meet them in Hay-on-Wye. You'd meet them in Sydney at the Sydney Writers' Festival. But there was no literary festival within India which celebrated Indian writing. And I got together with 2 other people, Namita Gokhale, who was very passionate about the other literatures of India in Hindi, Bengali, Marathi, and giving them a decent crack of the whip. And I think in our last pre-pandemic festival in Jaipur, we had 24 different languages represented within India. But we also teamed up with a wonderful man called Sanjoy Roy, who runs a production company called Teamwork, who is a kind of impresario of genius and totally unflappable, incredibly affable, runs a very happy ship of very young volunteers. And it's been entirely pleasurable, and it continues to multiply. Somehow, having started sort of just in Jaipur, we now have satellites all over America, in Houston, in Toronto, in New York, Boulder, Colorado. We had our first one in York last night. I woke up this morning in York. We had our first one last night in Rome. I woke up this morning in Italy. Sorry, we haven't yet invaded York. It's coming, Sarah.
It's coming, Sarah. So you'll be warned.
Sanjoy suddenly announces, we're off to the Maldives next month, and off we go. It's very nice. I have a few complaints.
Good, yeah. Who would complain with Maldives? Right. On that cheery note, thanks, William. I think we have time for questions, comments, reflections from audience members. So, please, sir.
I have a question about.
I think we have volunteers who will sort of bring the mic down to you, so you don't have to struggle there.
I have a question about Persian and Urdu. I was wondering about the interface between Persian, which was one of the languages, of course, Bruce was expert in. I'm a Persianist too. I wonder whether, I'm Alan Williams, I was also in the book that we did for Bruce. I wondered about the interface between Persian and the responsibility of the East India Company in the de-Persianization of the country, of the company, I should say, and its responsibility, as I believe, for the suppression of Persian and, so to speak, the rising of Urdu to take over. It did end in Persian was no longer the language of the company, so to speak, after 1830. Is that correct?
1832 was the date.
1832, yes.
Yes, I think you're right. So Persian was the diplomatic and court language of India from the early 13th century up until, the East India Company stopped using it in 1832. which was linked to the fact they also removed the Mughal emperor was on the stamp, official stamp of the East India Company until that date. And so it was part of an active process of distancing themselves from their fealty to the Mughal emperor, which they had acknowledged until that point, and then they just decided not to. But I think the rise of Urdu is a separate issue, because Urdu had risen. Urdu started. I mean, it has older roots in Deccani and so on, but it's only with during the period of Shah Jahan and so on that it becomes the army language, and so when you have different nations coming together, this is a kind of starts off as a. And the word Urdu is the same as the English word horde, as in Mongol horde. But it takes root in Delhi. Ghalib describes it as a child found wandering in the bazaars of Shah Jahanabad. And it becomes a Delhi language. So the rise of Urdu as a poetic and as a literary language, I think, long predates the official abandonment of Persian by the company in 1832. And the benefactor, of course, is not, after Persian ceases to be a diplomatic language, the beneficiary is English rather than Urdu. So they are linked, but I think it's a very interesting subject to study, and it's a complex story. But I don't think there's a direct, I think the rise of Urdu precedes and is a separate thing, because Urdu, I think, never becomes the official language of the East India Company or the Raj. It's English which is then used, and so the rise of Urdu has its own trajectory and its own history, and its decline.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to know also, and I don't know our friend who you're interviewing, William Dalrymple, what your name is, but...
Indrajit.
Sorry.
My name, Indrajit.
Yes. Indrajit. Yes. Also, what your response to that question is. Thank you.
I'm not an expert on the Urdu-Persian interface, but I would hazard that, similar to what has been said, I think the rise of Urdu has quite separate roots. And in the 19th, 20th centuries, it gets embroiled in what comes to be called the Hindi-Urdu controversy, which directs it towards a totally different stance. And I think Persian gets completely marginalized in any conversations around language in India, because it is then, of course, seen as a court language of the Mughals, an external imposition, and no way in which anyone would like to have anything to do with Persian, neither the Hindus, of course, nor the Muslims, because they didn't want to be seen associated with what was a language of another country.
There's also
limited.
Absolutely,
yes.
And there's also another sort of thing going on at the same time, which is the within the company, the battle between the Anglicizers and the Sanskriters.
Yes.
So you have people like my forebear James Prinsep, who and he and his brother Henry Toby Prinsep fight a big battle with Macaulay in Calcutta Town Hall, and they have public debates. This is a major issue at the time, and they want to teach and work in Indian languages and to have the East India Company cadets schooled as well as in these literatures, while the Macaulay famously says that, a single shelf of a good English library is worth more than the entire native literature of India and Arabia, and so this stuff is publicly debated. And basically, Prinsep loses. The Orientalists lose to the Anglicers.
Yes, and the fallout, of course, is like you say. It's English, and then everything else, and then Hindi and Urdu sort of are reduced to sideshows to what then is really English becoming the language of business, so to speak, across India.
The good outcome of that, although so much is lost and there's massive cultural destruction because of that decision. But the good outcome is that so many people in modern India speak English and can integrate into the wider business world, and therefore, you know, Indian software operators and back office stuff can go on with banks in America, and Infosys can mend the computers of Goldman Sachs overnight or whatever, you know, that sort of thing opens up opportunities.
And I guess it allows India itself to sort of somehow navigate its linguistic diversity as well. So rather than one language dominating others, everyone can sit comfortably disliking English, but living with it because of all the reasons that you mentioned.
Exactly.
Yes, and having this conversation. Any other questions, thoughts? Yes, please.
Thank you. Just kind of picking up on what was said in the answer to the last question about sort of Englishness and almost like otherness at times, and in the past and in empires and in India, that kind of idea of sort of reclaiming Indian history has been quite a big thing that you've sort of done in your works and in your writing, and I just wanted to ask about how you've maybe been able to navigate sort of resistance to that, or how you've sort of...
To resistance to what?
Sort of resistance to your attempt, I guess, to really explore Indian history and looking at like diversities within it, and just sort of how you've been able to sort of embark on that journey, really. Just as someone who's a real fan of your works, just wanted to find out more about that.
So, I don't know. I mean, as I said, politically, I mean, I've fallen out with this government over different things, but I don't think these books have provoked any strong resistance from the Hindu right. One of the things that I was very lucky with, in a sense, there was a very odd thing going on in Indian history writing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which was almost a cult of obscurity. And movements such as the Subaltern Studies movement produced works excellently aimed at the underrepresented sections of society, but also but produced in a very elite language of post-colonial jargon that was, you know, almost gatekeeping, and would exclude most people that were interested in reading history. And the kind of book I was writing, narrative history, biographically driven, with character, written in prose that you hope people would enjoy as much as they could, simply wasn't being written in India when I started in the 90s. And there were a few people like Ram Guha, but there was an extraordinary absence of biography, there was an absence of narrative history. And while you saw this on the prize list, for example, so while there would be major Indian novelists winning the fiction prizes, such as the Booker, year after year after year, and Pakistani writers and Sri Lankan writers, the non-fiction prizes, such as the Samuel Johnson, or now called the Baillie Gifford, or any of the big biography or history prizes, never had Indian authors on it. In fact, in the history of the Baillie Gifford, which is almost as long as that of the Booker, I think only Ram, Samant Subramaniam, and this year, a wonderful Bangladeshi writer writing on Islam in Eastern Europe, have ever been on the list. So you have a very different... India would be the world's leading first 11 in fiction, but would be, hovering with Afghanistan and Scotland for on the non-fiction. I was able to operate and sell books in a way that would have been much more difficult if there'd been a whole generation of talented non-fiction writers. So I was very lucky in the sense that it was at that point, isn't it? Now suddenly you're having many, many people like Manu Pillai and Aramukoti and many others now writing this sort of book, but they weren't being written when I arrived. So I had. On the other hand, it meant that people often didn't understand what I was doing, and I got kind of more and more irritated and semi-murderous with reviews of the White Mughals that described it as a novel. When you spent 5 years working on the primary sources, writing a book with 200 pages of footnotes, that for it to be, I mean, and it was just not understanding. It was, if it was something that had a love story, it had to be a novel. It couldn't be true.
What was your...
So there's some bafflement rather than resistance, I think.
What was your favorite sort of review comment, if I may ask? What
Favorite?
really got you off? I mean, favorite in a sarcastic sense. What really got you off?
Some of the reviews of my early books, like City of Gins and White Mughals, were. I got some pretty patronising reviews for those others. But the books have continued to sell and sell and sell and sell and sell, and I now sell many, many more copies in India than I do here.
Yeah.
And Anarchy, in particular, was the best-selling non-fiction book that year, and sold, I think, 5 times as many copies in India than it has in England.
Yes, ma'am. Can you hear? If the mic is getting...
Thank you. You touched on all your ancestors, or whatever you call it, forebears, who are all in India as well. Have I missed something, or have you written that story, your own family story? So, if not, it'd be great, wouldn't it?
They all come in and out of my books. There's lots and lots of Dalrymples in all those books, but I don't sort of go out to point their connection. The East India Company was very specific in the class it drew from. It never was of interest to the grand aristocracy, to the dukes and earls and so on, because 2/3 of the people that went out never came back. So it was a very high-risk strategy. But to people from my family, which is sort of minor squirearchy and sort of also vicars' sons from Northern Ireland, but people who were well connected but were not the top aristocracy. It was a major way of restore. If your social ambitions were greater than your economic economic worth, you would send out the sons to India, and they might die, but if they didn't, you had a chance you might strike lucky on the great Indian jackpot. And the East India Company was, one of the important points to run. The East India Company was a corporation that went out to India to enrich its servants. People joined it for the same reasons they joined Goldman Sachs or McKinsey's today. No one thinks it's going to be much fun to work for them. It's going to be very hard work. In this case, you might well die, particularly if you're in the East India Company Army, where I think the death rates were even higher. But if you did strike lucky, and you did get to loot a city in the case of the army, or get to do some nefarious deals in the case of the East India Company, and assets stripped Hubbard, or put yourself in a position to receive massive bribes from a Nawab or something, you could come back with a huge fortune in 10 or 15 years. And so many of the great houses of Yorkshire, of the Scots Borders, of the Highlands, from this period of about 1750 to 1790 are either East India Company loot or Royal African Company and Caribbean slave trade. And something we all need to learn, that when we see these gorgeous houses littering the countryside, so many of them from that period come from one of those two very dirty sources. And when we look at a gorgeous Palladian house, immediately you think of Colin Firth and and lovely sort of Jane Austen-y scenes and Sunday night bonnet dramas on BBC. But the economic reality of those buildings. I gave a talk this time last week. I was speaking at Kirtlington Park outside Oxford in a festival called the Kite Festival. And I said this on stage. And I said, I'm not quite sure where the money for Kirtlington came from, but it probably was one or the other. It turned out to be both. It was the Dashwoods, and some of the greatest Zophanies of the most gorgeous images of 18th century British life in Calcutta are the Dashwood family and the Oriel family. And he painted them endlessly. They were very artistic. They played the harpsichord. But they also looted the hell out of Ovid and amassed a fortune hugely in excess of their business operations or their company salary. And the result was cut into part. But there were cousins, also Dashwoods, who were in Barbados and were, had massive slave money going in. So it is something that we, so often we like to romanticize in this country our colonial past, and all the way through the 80s, Jewel in the Crown and all those merchant ivory films and lovely images of similar lawns with Maharajas playing croquet and elephants swishing their tails and beautiful ladies wafting over the Bangalore Club lawn and passage to India and all the rest of it. And we don't wrestle with the central fact, which is that it was invading somebody else's country and extracting their wealth. And when the East India Company was founded, the figures hugely contested, but Angus Maddison's figures are roughly that England had between 3 and 7% of the world's GDP in 1600 when the East India Company was founded, and Mughal India had about 40% of the world's GDP. In 1947, when the Raj ends, those figures are more or less reversed. India's down to single figures, and Britain is well, not quite by 1947 the world's premier economy, because America is, but it's still the richest country in Europe. And so much of that comes either from money extracted from India or the slave trade.
We have 3 questions. I don't know how much time we have. Maybe can we take all 3 questions together?
Whatever.
And then you're able to...
I'm going nowhere else. Just after a drink.
Yeah, which is good stuff, I guess. Yes.
Hi. So just building on what you were talking about then, it does seem that outside this room there is a very a general lack of understanding of what the British Empire was, how it contributes to the way the country is today. For example, with the Jubilee celebrations and the talk of the Commonwealth. In my son's school, there was no acknowledgement of what the Commonwealth is or where it was founded. I'm British also, by the way, so don't think that I'm criticizing. But I wonder, what do you think we can do about this? How can we bring this understanding to the wider public, or hopefully back into the school curriculum?
So education has to be the beginning of it. But even that's, as you know, heavily contested. There was a move to, very recently, to have more teaching of the empire. And my friend and colleague Satnam Sanghera was asked to put forward ideas, but that's been nixed by this government in the last 2 weeks. It's a crucial and massively important thing, because sitting where I sit in India, you see hundreds of friends coming out from here and assuming that the Indians are our best friends and that they love us and they're thrilled with the Raj as we are, and it's all, and E.M. Forster's their favourite book and Kipling's a delicious read, and of course, absolutely not true. It's too much Neil Ferguson. But it's. So it is only by education, by getting it into the history curriculum, will this begin to change. And only then we'll be able to look at things like what stuff in our museums was acquired through war crimes and massive injustice. And a whole lot of other things open up after that. But at this point, it's just being reduced to culture wars, and the Tories see it as something that they can win, that with the help of the Daily Mail and a few YOYs in the comment pages, that people will resist this as lefty woke attacks on national heroes. So it has to be done carefully and sympathetically and in a balanced way, if it's to get anywhere. Which isn't to say that as a historian you can't write the truth and put it out there, but in terms of winning the country over, there's a long march. I think it's changing. I mean, people are now beginning to be aware of this, and the fact that these culture wars have begun to break out and the battle lines are now established is at least a start in that. But it's really important because and it's not just in India. You know, you see Brits going to Ireland just not knowing about the potato famine. You see Brits in Australia or Tasmania not knowing what's happened to the extermination of Aboriginal peoples, and it's the single biggest thing the Brits ever did, the British Empire, but it's not taught in any of our schools. And it's a bizarre thing. You can learn about other empires. You can learn about the Roman Empire. You can learn about... but you just don't learn about our empire. And it puts us at a massive disadvantage. And as you say, it is reflected in contemporary politics. So, you know, Brexit is related to this sensation that not understanding our place in the world, and then or now.
Okay, we have 2 more questions here. Do you want to just...
Thank you. I don't have a question, but rather a comment. Thank you so much for today. We've laughed, we've learned. It's very classic Bruce. I just wanted to say I think it's a good thing that he worked that night, because if he was up at the same time as you, I think you guys would talk all the time and not get any work done.
That's wonderful.
So thank you so much for today.
Thank you.
Well, is this? Yeah, it's working. I wanted to ask about Bruce too, but it is a question because of all the things I associate with Bruce, all his many talents. I wouldn't naturally put diplomacy in there. And yet he was working in some of the most hair-raising political regimes in the world. How did he not get shot?
Well, that's a good question to end on, so yes, go for it.
Well, I mean, I think he had some hairy moments. I think, you know, he didn't leave Iran of his own volition, I understand. And when I met him in Islamabad, he'd had to leave Peshawar because he'd begun receiving what they call their night letters, which are basically threats. And again, I'm not quite sure what the story was, whether it was him at work in the demi-mode or other activities which Bruce would engage in, but you know, yeah, I think he had some pretty close calls, and particularly in Afghanistan. I mean, it sounds nuts what he did with the Mujh going in on his donkey. I mean, any of that could have gone very, very. I mean, he did. Looking at photographs, you know, he did look amazingly. He passed off very well with a beard and on a horseback with a turban, and with his perfect Persian. I mean, I met people in Herat who were just astonished at the perfection of his Dari. He really could speak completely accentless Dari and Farsi, both, you know, modern Tehrani Farsi and the old sort of courtly Dari of Afghanistan, old-fashioned. And accentless, perfect, idiomatic, in a way that very, very few people do. But even so, you know, obviously he was a Brit, and you know, he wasn't an Afghan. And any of those adventures could have gone very, very badly wrong. But they never quite did. I don't think he ever, I mean, you say he wasn't a diplomat, but he was enormously charming. And he could talk his way into any house or anything, and then stay there for as long as he wanted, often for years at a time.
Do you speak from experience?
with great pleasure. My father died just before Bruce got ill himself, and I remember going off to the funeral. We left a full. It was winter in Delhi, which can get quite cold. So we left lots of wood in the woodshed, quite a lot of wine in the wine cellar. Not a wine cellar, just a couple of crates of wine in the basement, in the box room, and everything in quite good order. We came back a month later after my father's funeral. All the wood had gone, all the wine had gone, all the beer had gone, but the terrace outside Bruce's room had been transformed into what we call the Hanging Gardens of Bruce, which every charpoy, every sort of nice lamp, every pot plant in the house had magically relocated up to this extraordinary sort of queue which had apparated on the roof of the house. And he'd had these there'd been some Persian musicians he'd met in Delhi, and he'd had a whole series of very wonderful parties, and people used to come up for months afterwards and congratulate me on the wonderful parties I threw, which I had absolutely no knowledge of.
Well, I think we should bring this evening to a close. Thank you so much, William.
Thank you all for coming.
Entertained us, you've taught us. Dare I say, you've thrown in a bit of decolonization in there as well in a very entertaining way. So thank you so much. I should say again that there is, I think there are books outside which William is sort of happy to sign if you wanted him to sign sold books. So it's being sold by our independent Allen, I think they're Fox Allen Books. So do go and have a look. Thank you again. Thank you so much, and thanks to Sarah.